If you're at all someone who considers yourself to be a game music aficionado or retro game enthusiast, you've probably heard of Tim and Geoff Follin, who composed the soundtracks of multiple NES and SNES era licensed games. While most of these games never spawned any large franchises, remakes, or sequels, they are still talked about today because of how revolutionary the soundtracks were. Sadly, only a few weeks ago, Geoff Follin passed away, so in this video, we'll commemorate the brothers' works throughout the years and see what made these soundtracks so game-changing. I'm not particularly good at biographies, so I'm just going to go through some of my personal favorites from the Follin brothers' works. Tim's earliest video game tunes were for the home computers of the 80s, like the Commodore 64 or the ZX Spectrum. Definitely one of the coolest things about the Follin brothers' music is simply how good it sounds, despite the technical limitations of the system it was released on. The ZX Spectrum's audio capabilities seem rudimentary even by NES standards. There was a simple beeper that could produce 1-bit audio across 3 channels, meaning 3 distinct voices. And let me tell you, that sound was crunchy. Let's hear a few examples. Tim wrote some music for a few games on the ZX Spectrum, such as Chronos or the aforementioned Raw Recruit. And yet, my favorite track of his on this system wasn't even for a game. As far as I'm aware, it's an original composition of his that was published in the Your Sinclair magazine, which talked about gaming news primarily for the Spectrum. And when I say published in the magazine, I don't mean sheet music. They printed the hex code and readers were encouraged to painstakingly transcribe it into their computers, which would then run a program that plays the tune. But their hard work definitely paid off, because this is the tune that plays. I honestly could not believe my ears when I first heard this. It's a bit crunchy for sure, but what I love is how bold and unapologetic the tune is. It doesn't sound like it's working around any limitations of the system. With only 3 voices, there shouldn't be a lot of room for harmonic complexity, and though the chords as vertical slices aren't anything super exciting, the movement between the chords frequently breaks out of any sense of tonality, creating this moving sequence of chords with hardly any relationship between them. We don't feel like we're in any key for more than a few measures at most, and any pockets of tonality are modal. The beginning sounds a bit G Mixolydian, but then later we have this darker B Phrygian kind of sound. It's just really all over the place. But even with pretty much everything playing in a rhythmic unison, it's relatively easy to hear the distinct melody, harmony, and bass lines. And it comes together with these sequences of interesting chords and time sig switch-ups to create this almost prog rock-like groove, which is something we will definitely see a lot of in the brothers' later tunes as well. But overall, my favorite thing about this tune is just how tonally ambiguous it is. It definitely has that kind of 80s sound for me, especially in that first line, but I otherwise couldn't really say what emotion this tune makes me feel, or even is intended to make me feel. I also would have never in a million years thought of anything like this if I was asked to write a 3-voice tune for a tiny speaker to be published in a computer magazine. Simply bananas. But anyways, a few years later, Tim would begin to work more on home console games, starting with the NES. One of his most well-known tunes from this era is the theme from Solstice. Another unbelievable banger. A lot of really cool things are happening here. After After this cheeky, plinky intro, we're thrown into these sweeping chords that seem impossible given the 5-voice limitation. The NES has 2 pulse channels, usually for melody and harmony. 1 triangle for bass. 1 noise for drums. And 1 versatile sample channel, which we'll take a look at in a second. But what this means is that chords with more than 3 notes are typically impossible, but Tim employs a technique here that arpeggiates these chords, playing each note in quick succession, giving the illusion of this grand sound. Another subtle thing that's so cool to me is the usage of the sample channel. Other NES games have used this channel for surprisingly coherent spoken words.
Hi, let's play hide and speak.
But in Solstice, this channel is used for just kick and snare samples. This isn't particularly uncommon. Super Mario Bros. 3, which released in the same year, also used this channel for drums, like this steel drummy tom. Whereas in Mario, the drums are meant to be evocative of a particular style, I'm fairly certain the drum samples in Solstice serve the more utilitarian purpose of allowing the kick and snare to play underneath the cymbals, which are all produced using the noise channel. All of this, of course, serves to have bigger and more realistic drum parts, and this pursuit of realism does seem to be a goal of the Follin brothers' compositions. One thing I find hilarious about this tune is that Solstice isn't even some epic action-adventure, it's pretty much a puzzle game with light adventure elements. The title theme goes so unnecessarily hard, but who cares, it sounds great. Shortly after Solstice, Geoff joined Tim as co-composer of the Silver Surfer game, also for the NES. Let's take a listen to the Level 1 theme. This tune starts with a fanfare-like intro using the same arpeggiation technique and drum layering from Solstice. But one immediate difference I really like is the programming on that lead. Despite being a simple pulse wave, the delays, bends in and out, and whammy-like vibrato on that last note makes this melody feel like it's being performed on an actual electric guitar. It takes not only such meticulous programming, but it just sounds so intuitive and natural, almost like it was actually played and then squashed into 8 bits. And then afterwards we have this insane guitar-like riff that similarly grooves so hard, and it only gets better with the drums kicking in and the bass playing the same groove an octave lower. I'm not even sure what else there is to say. The tune is just really good and strangely only gets better. These prog-like influences are only becoming more prominent. A bit out of order, but while working on the script, I found myself listening to one soundtrack that I unexpectedly really liked, and funny enough, none of the tunes are even original. Blizzard's Rock and Roll Racing on the SNES, as the name would imply, features mostly arrangements of rock tunes. I'm especially fascinated by that cover of Bad to the Bone, that one song from Megamind.
I'll always be a villain.
Okay, but for real, take a listen to how good this sounds. That intro riff just has so much color. Just like in Silver Surfer, all of the guitar programming just feels so lifelike. Even though the SNES supports a wider array of sounds and it's literally a sampled electric guitar, there's still so much care taken to make these bends and slides sound authentic to the original. During the parts where they're singing in the original, it's thoughtfully replaced by this wailing lead electric guitar type sound that somehow has even more character. Everything down to the attack, length of each note, and intuitive slides just match the original vocal quality so perfectly. I just thought it was pretty cool. I've heard a lot of licensed music in video games, but this is really one of the few that I feel like is almost worth listening to alongside the original. It's just that well programmed. But on the topic of the SNES, there's probably no better game to talk about than perhaps the Follin's most famous one. Plok for the SNES is a simple, colorful platformer, featuring the titular Plok as he exterminates fleas who infiltrated his island. One of the most iconic Follin Brothers tunes can be heard in the beach theme. just really feels like the culmination of everything we've heard thus far, and yet still so different. It leans more prog than just straight rock, replacing the guitar riffs with these scintillating major 7 chords that just move around in constant structure. And the time signature is 7/8, with this repeating long, short pattern that gives the tune so much momentum. And the entire track is also tuned slightly sharp to A447, which to me at least makes it feel so right. And this Moog-like synthy sound is also a cool departure from their more guitar-heavy tunes, yet the more prog rock sensibilities remain. The harmony is so out and meanders from this E major-ish sound down into B flat major a whole tritone away. But even still, the harmony establishes this 1 to flat 7 kind of sound, feeling a bit modal, especially with that B flat staying consistent in the bass. And then completely out of nowhere, the groove switches up to this 4/4 funky city pop-ish kind of sound. We jump into G major, and the synth chords now have this complex, jumpy, slidey rhythm, which is just pitch bends and volume automation. It's similarly cool and modal. We have these spicy C minor, F, and B flat chords, and the bass hits Fs and E flats, all of which giving some sprinklings of a G minor kind of sound. Tim has said this section was intended to evoke a Stevie Wonder kind of vibe, and I can totally see that. The unison horns come in with the melody, over these chords that also jump around to interesting places, and of course shortly afterwards there's a gratuitous guitar solo. It's just such a frenetic sound that seems almost impossible to accomplish on the SNES. I could definitely be convinced that this came from a whole generation afterwards. There's the familiar depth of articulation programming that we've seen in their previous tunes. Notes are held slightly longer with fades to simulate reverb or delay. The notes in the intro are panned left and right for this cool stereo effect. And even guitar fret sounds are simulated with MIDI data. As the legend famously goes, Shigeru Miyamoto himself, upon hearing the Plok soundtrack for the first time, thought it was an elaborate prank and took apart the game to understand how it sounded so good. That's not a joke, by the way, supposedly that actually happened. Composer David Wise even stated that when it came to video game scores, his inspirations for Donkey Kong Country were Mario, Zelda, and Plok, which is just hilarious to me, but also so well deserved. I find it really cool that pretty much none of the Follin Brothers games had a lasting cultural impact apart from the music. They never made a Solstice 2, and Plok got his indie platformer spot in Smash taken by Gimli. And yet these games are all still talked about 35 years later. I suppose that's just the power of great music. The fact that I'm not even the first music theory YouTuber to talk about the Follin Brothers says enough. Speaking of which, I haven't even scratched the surface. There are so many other bangers I didn't even talk about today, like their work on Pictionary or the Spider-Man X-Men game. So go take a listen to those, and also listen to the full versions of the songs I talked about today. Legendary tunes which absolutely deserve their spots in the Video Game Music Hall of Fame. Rest in peace, Geoff.